The battles of Lexington and Concord, 1775. The American Revolution officially ignited on the morning of April 19, 1775, with the battles of Lexington and Concord, often immortalized as the shot heard round the world. This clash was far more than an ordinary military encounter. It marked a historic turning point in which political tensions between the North American colonies and Britain escalated irreversibly into armed conflict. To fully grasp the significance of Lexington and Concord, one must examine the causes leading to the confrontation, the events of that fateful day, and the profound consequences that followed. First, the background. Following the 7 Years' War, 1756-1763, the British government faced a severe financial crisis, burdened with enormous debt. To recover revenue, Parliament imposed a series of taxes on the 13 American colonies, including the Stamp Act of 1765 and the Tea Act of 1773. These measures provoked fierce resistance, most famously the Boston Tea Party, 1773, when American patriots disguised as Native Americans dumped an entire cargo of British tea into the harbor. In retaliation, Parliament passed the Coercive Acts to punish Massachusetts, thereby intensifying colonial resentment. Within this atmosphere, revolutionary fervor spread rapidly. In Massachusetts, local militias, known as the Minutemen for their ability to mobilize at a minute's notice, began stockpiling weapons and preparing for armed confrontation. By April 1775, General Thomas Gage, the military governor of Massachusetts, received orders from London to restore order. He secretly dispatched roughly 700 British troops from Boston to Concord, where colonial militias had amassed weapons. At the same time, he intended to arrest two prominent Patriot leaders, Samuel Adams and John Hancock, who were sheltering near Lexington. However, secrecy proved impossible. The Patriot Intelligence Network, led by the Sons of Liberty, swiftly uncovered the plan. On the night of April 18, 1775, writers such as Paul Revere, William Dawes, and Samuel Prescott galloped through the countryside, spreading the urgent warning: "The British are coming." This legendary midnight ride ensured that colonial militias were prepared. At dawn on April 19, 1775, in the small town of Lexington, about 77 Massachusetts militiamen assembled on the village green to confront the advancing British troops led by Major John Pitcairn. Around 5 a.m., the two forces stood face to face in tense silence. Suddenly, a shot rang out, its source unknown, and within moments, volleys of musket fire shattered the morning calm. In mere minutes, 8 militiamen lay dead and 10 wounded, while British casualties were minimal. Though militarily a defeat, Lexington became a powerful symbol. Ordinary farmers had dared to resist the mightiest army in the world. The British continued their march toward Concord, only to find that most colonial supplies had already been hidden or removed. At the North Bridge near Concord, however, about 400 militiamen confronted them. A fierce exchange of fire ensued, this time with the colonists gaining the upper hand and forcing the British to retreat. What followed was a disastrous withdrawal for the Redcoats. As they retreated the 30 kilometers back to Boston, American militias poured in from across the countryside, sniping relentlessly from behind trees, fences, and houses. By nightfall, nearly 90 militiamen had been killed or wounded, but British losses were far heavier: 273 soldiers killed, wounded, or missing. The battles of Lexington and Concord were not only military engagements, but also psychological milestones. They demonstrated that the colonists were willing to shed blood for liberty. What had begun as political protest and economic resistance had now erupted into a full-scale war. News of the clashes spread swiftly across the 13 colonies, igniting both outrage and determination. Within weeks, tens of thousands of colonial militiamen besieged Boston in what became the Siege of Boston, lasting nearly a year. Meanwhile, the Second Continental Congress convened, establishing the Continental Army and appointing George Washington as its commander-in-chief, an essential step toward colonial unity. Symbolically, Lexington and Concord represented the first shots of the Revolution. They made clear that reconciliation with Britain was no longer possible. The battles also proved that untrained, poorly equipped militias could stand up to professional royal troops. The enduring image of the farmer with a musket, became an icon of American resolve. For centuries thereafter, April 19th has been commemorated in Massachusetts and beyond as a reminder that freedom must be won through sacrifice. In conclusion, the battles of Lexington and Concord were the spark that ignited the American Revolution. With a single anonymous shot on an April morning, an entire people embarked on the path toward independence. From that moment onward, there was no turning back. The 13 colonies had chosen to fight to the end to break free from the dominance of the British Crown. The Battle of Bunker Hill, 1775. Just 2 months after Lexington and Concord, when the atmosphere of war had engulfed all of Massachusetts, the first major confrontation between British forces and colonial militias erupted at Charlestown, near Boston. This event entered history as the Battle of Bunker Hill, fought on June 17, 1775. Although the British ultimately secured control of the battlefield, the true significance of the clash lay elsewhere. It demonstrated that colonial militias, when properly organized and commanded, were fully capable of standing toe-to-toe with the King's regular army. The origins of the battle can be traced back to April 1775. After their setback during the March to Concord, British troops retreated into Boston, where they found themselves besieged by thousands of militiamen from Massachusetts and New England. Boston was effectively surrounded on land, with only the sea routes secured by the Royal Navy. Seeking to break the encirclement and regain the initiative, General Thomas Gage, Commander-in-Chief of British forces, planned to seize the surrounding high ground, particularly the Charlestown Peninsula, which included Bunker Hill and Breeds Hill. Control of these elevations would allow the British to dominate Boston Harbor with artillery. On the colonial side, the Massachusetts Committee of Safety and militia leaders learned of Gage's plan. On the night of June 16, 1775, about 1,200 militiamen under Colonel William Prescott, supported by Israel Putnam and Dr. Joseph Warren, secretly advanced to Charlestown. Instead of fortifying the higher, more distant Bunker Hill, they dug trenches and built earthworks on the nearer Breeds Hill, which overlooked Boston directly. At dawn, the British awoke to find that, in a single night, their opponents had constructed a fortress looming over the city. On the morning of June 17, 1775, British generals William Howe and Sir Henry Clinton led some 2,200 troops against the colonial positions. Warships on the Charles River bombarded Charlestown, setting much of the town aflame. The British then launched repeated frontal assaults up the exposed slope of Breeds Hill. Despite their superior numbers and discipline, they faced devastating musket fire from the entrenched militiamen. Prescott, Putnam, and Warren ordered their men to conserve ammunition, commanding them to hold fire until the enemy was within close range, an order remembered in legend as, "Don't fire until you see the whites of their eyes." The first 2 assaults ended in bloody repulse. Hundreds of redcoats fell, and their formations wavered under the relentless volleys. Even senior officers were struck down. The Americans, shielded by their fortifications and fighting with grim determination, inflicted disproportionate losses. Yet during the 3rd assault, the colonists' ammunition ran low. Forced into hand-to-hand combat, they fought desperately with bayonets, musket butts, and even stones. Overwhelmed, the defenders abandoned Breeds Hill and retreated in orderly fashion to Bunker Hill and beyond. During the withdrawal, Dr. Joseph Warren, one of Massachusetts' most beloved revolutionary leaders, was killed, transforming him into a martyr and enduring symbol of the cause. Casualties were staggering, particularly for the British. Of the 2,200 troops engaged, 1,054 were killed or wounded, nearly half their force, including many officers. This 50% casualty rate made the battle one of the costliest of the entire war. By contrast, American losses totaled about 450 dead and wounded. Although the colonists had been driven from their positions, they had proven a critical point. With proper defenses and leadership, they could fight the King's army on equal terms. The significance of the Battle of Bunker Hill was immense. For Americans, it was a moral triumph. Rather than despairing over the loss of ground, they celebrated the fact that a fledgling, semi-trained militia had inflicted massive losses on the world's most formidable army. The event galvanized the colonies, reinforcing the conviction that armed resistance was both possible and necessary. For Britain, the news caused shock and unease. Reports of heavy casualties reached London and triggered heated debates in Parliament over the feasibility of subduing the 13 colonies by force, further deepening political divisions. The timing was also crucial. The battle occurred only days after the Continental Congress in Philadelphia had voted to establish the Continental Army under General George Washington. For Washington, traveling from Virginia to Boston to assume command, the news of Bunker Hill was both inspiring and sobering. It revealed the extraordinary courage of the New England militias, while also underscoring the urgent need for a professional army and more reliable logistics to sustain a protracted war. Thus, the Battle of Bunker Hill stands as the first truly large-scale engagement of the American Revolution. Though technically of British victory, its strategic outcome favored the colonies. It demonstrated their capacity to fight head-on, boosted morale across America, and transformed the resistance into a more unified, organized struggle. In American memory, Bunker Hill endures as a timeless emblem of courage, immortalized in monuments and commemorations as a reminder that independence was bought with blood. The Virginia Declaration of Rights, 1776. After the battles of Lexington and Concord, April 1775, and Bunker Hill, June 1775, it became clear that the conflict between the 13 colonies and Great Britain had gone far beyond a mere local uprising. Massachusetts militiamen, together with forces from other New England colonies, had besieged Boston, yet their troops were still little more than improvised militias, lacking coordination, logistics, and, most importantly, a legitimate central authority recognized across all the colonies. In this context, the need for a unified, intercolonial regular army became urgent. Out of this necessity was born the idea of the Continental Army, a decisive turning point in the transformation of scattered colonies into an independent nation. Politically, the backdrop was set in May 1775, when the Second Continental Congress convened in Philadelphia on May 10th. At first, many delegates still hoped for reconciliation with the mother country, and some even trusted in the possibility of compromise with King George III. Yet the military situation in Massachusetts forced immediate action. New England militias were maintaining the siege of Boston, but without Continental support, they risked exhausting food and ammunition. The Battle of Bunker Hill had underscored the point. Militia bravery alone was insufficient for a long war without professional organization and command. On June 14, 1775, Congress made a historic decision to formally establish the Continental Army, incorporating the militia besieging Boston along with other units to be raised and financed by Congress. This was revolutionary, for it signaled that the colonies would no longer act in isolation but were beginning to operate as a single, coordinated entity, the embryo of a future nation. Equally crucial was the choice of leadership. Several names were proposed, but Congress ultimately reached consensus on George Washington, a delegate from Virginia. The choice carried layered significance. Washington was a seasoned officer from the French and Indian War, respected for both his experience and personal stature. Moreover, he came from the South. Appointing a Virginian to command an army dominated by New Englanders was a shrewd political move, forging North-South unity and ensuring the struggle would not be dismissed as merely Massachusetts rebellion. On June 15, 1775, Washington was officially appointed Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army. Upon accepting command, Washington displayed characteristic modesty. He confessed to Congress that he did not believe himself fully equal to the task, and he refused a salary, asking only to be reimbursed for necessary expenses. This humility enhanced both his credibility and the trust placed in him. On July 3, 1775, Washington formally took command of the forces besieging Boston at Cambridge, Massachusetts. From that moment, the image of scattered farmers with muskets gradually evolved into a single army under the Continental banner. Alongside Washington's appointment, Congress passed several other key resolutions. On June 14th, the same day the Army was founded, it authorized 2 rifle regiments from Pennsylvania, Maryland, and Virginia, the beginning of recruitment across multiple colonies. On June 16th, Congress appointed Washington, together with Philip Schuyler, Charles Lee, and Israel Putnam, as senior generals. On June 27th and 30th, It established vital support bodies such as the Committee of Supply and the Committee of Ordnance. Step by step, the foundations of a national military apparatus began to emerge. From the outset, however, the Continental Army faced immense difficulties. First, discipline and organization were fragile. The soldiers were mostly farmers and artisans, volunteering for short terms, unaccustomed to strict military order. Washington confronted desertion, lack of training, and even insubordination. Second, logistics and finance were dire. The Continental Congress lacked a strong treasury, and supplies of food, powder, and uniforms were constantly scarce. Third, weaponry was insufficient. Muskets, gunpowder, and artillery were in short supply, forcing reliance on smuggling and covert support from France and Spain. Even so, the creation of the Continental Army carried profound historical significance. It transformed a patchwork of militias into a common force, laying the foundation of a nation with its own military. It also sent a bold political message to Britain and the world. The colonies were now united, no longer mere provincial territories, but a people moving towards self-determination. Washington's appointment reinforced that message, turning him into a national symbol even before the Declaration of Independence in 1776. The impact of this decision extended far beyond 1775. In the long run, the Continental Army became the nucleus of the modern United States Army. Though plagued throughout the war by shortages, setbacks, and near collapse, it endured long enough to secure French assistance, ultimately defeating the British Empire. After the war, Washington resigned his commission, cementing the principle that the military must remain subordinate to civilian authority, a tradition that continues to define American political life. In sum, the creation of the Continental Army was a defining moment in the early American Revolution. It marked the transition from local resistance to national war, from disjointed militias to a regular army, from fragmented colonies to an emerging nation. Without this decision, the revolutionary movement might well have collapsed within months. Because of it, the flame of independence endured, leading only a year later to the colony's declaration of sovereignty on the world stage. The United States Declaration of Independence, 1776. In the early stage of the war, shortly after the Continental Army was established and George Washington assumed command at Cambridge, Massachusetts, the Continental Congress and its generals quickly realized that Boston was not the only front. To the north, Britain's colony of Quebec, Canada, held immense strategic value. If Quebec remained loyal to the crown, it would serve as a logistical base and a launching point for campaigns into New York and New England. Conversely, if the Americans could seize Quebec and win over the Canadians, particularly the French inhabitants, they would eliminate a northern threat while expanding the Revolutionary Front. Thus, as early as the summer of 1775, the invasion of Canada was launched. Politically, the moment was peculiar. The Continental Congress hoped that the people of Canada, mainly French Catholics, would sympathize with the colonial movement, since they too had endured British rule after the Treaty of Paris, 1763, ended the French and Indian War. Congress even issued an address to the inhabitants of the province of Quebec, urging them to join the colonies in resisting the tyranny of Parliament. In reality, however, the situation was far more complicated. While the French Canadians disliked British authority, they had little affinity with the 13 colonies, and many were wary of aligning with predominantly Protestant revolutionaries. Hopes of sparking a Canadian uprising to aid the Americans were, therefore, extremely slim. Militarily, the Canadian campaign unfolded along two main thrusts. The first, led by General Richard Montgomery, advanced north from New York along Lake Champlain and the Richelieu River, with the aim of capturing Montreal and then pressing on to Quebec. The second, far bolder, was commanded by Benedict Arnold, at that time still a loyal American officer. Arnold led some 1,100 men through the remote forests and mountains of Maine and Quebec, pushing toward Quebec City from the northeast. The plan was for both forces to converge and strike a decisive blow at the provincial capital. Montgomery's column set out first and achieved initial successes. In November 1775, after enduring logistical difficulties, he laid siege to Fort St. John's. After nearly 2 months, the British garrison surrendered on November 3rd, opening the way to Montreal. The city fell on November 13th with little resistance, as the British forces there were too weak. Montgomery then marched swiftly toward Quebec City to link up with Arnold. Meanwhile, Arnold's detachment faced one of the most grueling marches in American military history. The route through Maine was brutally unforgiving. Rugged terrain, freezing weather, dwindling provisions, starvation, disease, and desertion decimated the ranks. By the time Arnold reached Quebec in late November 1775, fewer than 600 exhausted but determined soldiers remained. They camped outside the city, awaiting Montgomery's arrival. By December, the two forces joined, but together they numbered only about 1,200 men, facing a city solidly defended by Governor Guy Carleton with thousands of troops and loyalist militia. Nonetheless, Montgomery and Arnold resolved to strike before the severe Canadian winter crippled their army. At dawn on December 31st, 1775, the assault on Quebec City unfolded amid a fierce snowstorm. Montgomery led one column into the lower town, but was cut down by artillery fire almost immediately, along with several key officers. His men collapsed into retreat. On the opposite flank, Arnold pressed forward through a narrow street, but was seriously wounded in the leg early in the fighting. Command fell to Daniel Morgan, a courageous officer who led his men in brutal street combat. Eventually, however, the Americans were surrounded and forced to surrender. Over 400 were captured, including Morgan, while the rest fled in disarray. The attack on Quebec ended in crushing defeat. After the disaster, the wounded Arnold stubbornly maintained a loose blockade of Quebec through the winter of 1776, but with inadequate troops and supplies. When spring arrived, British reinforcements crossed the Atlantic and counterattacked. By May 1776, the Americans were forced to retreat entirely from Canada, ending the campaign. The Canada Campaign was a critical test for the Continental Army. It reflected the boldness and ambition of revolutionary leaders who attempted to expand the war beyond the 13 colonies. Yet it also exposed their hard limits: inadequate logistics, insufficient manpower, lack of local support, and the brutal northern climate. The failure made clear that Canada could not easily be brought into the American cause, prompting the revolutionaries to focus on defending their own territory. Despite its failure, the campaign left important legacies. It elevated certain figures. Montgomery was hailed as a fallen martyr. Arnold, though later infamous as a traitor, was briefly celebrated as a hero, and Daniel Morgan distinguished himself as a fearless commander. Conversely, the defeat strengthened Britain's determination to hold Canada, ensuring the colony's role as a key base for future offensives, most notably the Saratoga Campaign of 1777. In sum, the invasion of Canada, 1775-1776, was a failed attempt at expansion but one of historical significance. It demonstrated the resilience and daring of American forces, while laying bare fatal weaknesses in supply, discipline, and alliances. In the aftermath, the revolutionaries concentrated on consolidating their position within the 13 colonies and, crucially, seeking external support, especially from France. The Battle of Long Island, 1776. After the failure in Canada, while the Continental Army was still struggling to maintain the siege of Boston, a deeper question gradually came into focus. Were the 13 colonies fighting merely to reclaim the rights of subjects under King George III, or were they moving toward a higher goal, full independence? In the early months of 1776, this question dominated political and military discourse on both sides of the Atlantic, ultimately giving rise to one of history's great documents, the Declaration of Independence. The background of the Declaration lay in the escalating clash between colony and mother country. Even after the first battles of 1775, the Second Continental Congress had sent King George III the so-called Olive Branch Petition, pleading for reconciliation, reaffirming loyalty to the Crown while protesting Parliament's repressive policies. Yet instead of responding favorably, George III rejected it outright, declaring the colonies to be in a state of open rebellion. In August 1775, he issued the Proclamation of Rebellion, and by year's end Parliament had passed punitive blockade acts and contracted thousands of Hessian mercenaries from Germany to fight in America. These moves extinguished any lingering hope of compromise. Meanwhile, American public opinion was transformed by a small but explosive pamphlet, Common Sense by Thomas Paine, published in January 1776. Paine argued that reconciliation with Britain was absurd, that a continent should not be ruled by a distant island, and that independence was the only natural and just course. The pamphlet sold more than 100,000 copies within months, an extraordinary figure for the era, and ignited popular enthusiasm for independence. Debate inside Congress grew increasingly intense. At first, many delegates, especially from the middle colonies such as Pennsylvania and New York, and from southern colonies like Maryland, hesitated, fearing that an early declaration might leave them isolated and economically vulnerable. But the pressures of war, the intransigence of George III, and the groundswell of opinion sparked by Paine gradually shifted the balance. The turning point came when North Carolina, April 1776, and Virginia, May 1776, formally instructed their delegates to vote for independence, decisively tilting momentum toward separation. On June 7, 1776, in Philadelphia, Richard Henry Lee of Virginia introduced a now famous motion, the Lee Resolution, that these united colonies are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states. Fierce debate followed. With some colonies still wavering, Congress postponed the vote and instead appointed a committee of 5 to draft a formal declaration explaining the reasons for independence. The committee consisted of Thomas Jefferson, Virginia; John Adams, Massachusetts; Benjamin Franklin, Pennsylvania; Roger Sherman, Connecticut; and Robert R. Livingston, New York. Though the youngest member, Jefferson was chosen as principal author, with Adams and Franklin providing revisions. In a small Philadelphia room during late June, Jefferson worked diligently. His draft opened with immortal words affirming the natural rights of man, that all men are created equal, endowed with unalienable rights, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. From this philosophical foundation, the Declaration argued that governments exist to secure these rights. When they become destructive of them, the people have the right to alter or abolish them. Jefferson then enumerated grievances against George III, dissolving colonial legislatures, imposing unjust taxation, maintaining standing armies, hiring foreign mercenaries, and more. This bill of indictment was meant to prove that the king had violated his role, releasing the colonies from any duty of allegiance. On June 28, 1776, the committee presented its draft to Congress. After several days of debate and revision, most notably the removal of a passage condemning slavery, which risked dividing North and South, the final text was adopted on July 2, 1776, when Congress approved the Lee Resolution. John Adams wrote that July 2nd would be remembered as Independence Day. Yet it was July 4, 1776, the date when Congress formally ratified the Declaration of Independence itself, that posterity enshrined as the nation's birthday. Once approved, the Declaration was printed and widely circulated. On July 8th, it was read publicly in Philadelphia, and soon afterward in cities, town squares, and even churches across the colonies. Crowds cheered, tore down statues of King George, and from that moment onward the colonies increasingly began to call themselves the United States of America. The significance of the Declaration extended far beyond the battlefield. First, it was a political statement. The colonies no longer sought accommodation, but openly proclaimed independence as their ultimate goal. This galvanized morale, convincing soldiers and civilians alike that they fought for a great ideal, not merely for lower taxes. Second, it was a diplomatic declaration. By breaking formally with Britain, America opened the way to seek support from European powers, especially France and Spain. Third, it was a human rights manifesto of global resonance. Jefferson's words inspired later revolutions, from the French Revolution of 1789 to 20th century independence movements in Asia and Africa. Of course, the Declaration was not without flaws. The excision of its anti-slavery passage revealed the compromises of the era and the contradiction between the phrase, "all men are created equal," and the persistence of slavery would haunt the United States for generations. Yet despite its limitations, the Declaration of Independence has endured as the nation's spiritual core, a founding charter of a new republic built on liberty and equality. In sum, the proclamation of the Declaration of Independence on July 4, 1776, marked a monumental turning point in the American Revolution. It transformed the struggle from a tax revolt into a war for independence, laid the ideological foundations of the United States, and sent a resounding message to the world. A new nation had been born, determined to claim its rightful place among the free peoples of the earth. The Battle of Trenton, 1776. Immediately after the Declaration of Independence was proclaimed on July 4, 1776, King George III and the British government were determined to prove that the rebellious colonies could not survive independently. To that end, they prepared the largest military campaign ever undertaken in North America, aiming directly at a vital political and economic center, New York. Situated at the mouth of the Hudson River, the city was of immense strategic importance. Whoever controlled New York would control the waterway linking Canada in the north with the southern colonies. For that reason, Washington also resolved to hold it at all costs, concentrating much of the Continental Army there. By early summer 1776, a massive British fleet appeared off Staten Island. Commanded by Admiral Richard Howe and his brother, General William Howe, it comprised over 400 ships and about 32,000 troops, including large numbers of German Hessian mercenaries. This was the largest expeditionary force Britain had ever sent outside Europe. Opposing them, Washington had around 19,000 men, mostly short-term recruits, poorly trained and equipped, spread across multiple positions along the East River and Long Island. On August 22, 1776, British forces began landing on Long Island, today's Brooklyn. Washington's main defensive line was positioned at the Heights of Guan, a ridge guarding the road to Brooklyn Heights, which overlooked the East River. However, the defenses had serious gaps, particularly at poorly guarded backroads. General Howe quickly recognized the opportunity and devised a plan of envelopment. At dawn on August 27, 1776, the British launched their attack. While one column engaged the Americans frontally, a large force of about 10,000 men under Howe himself maneuvered through the lightly defended Jamaica Pass, striking the American rear. By midday, the Americans were being assaulted from both front and rear. Fierce fighting erupted around Flatbush and Gowanus. Inexperienced and overwhelmed, the Americans were cut off and thrown into confusion. Thousands were killed, wounded, or captured, including Generals John Sullivan and Lord Stirling. Amid the disaster, there were moments of heroism. The Maryland 400, a contingent of Maryland troops, made repeated sacrificial charges against overwhelming British forces to buy time for their comrades to retreat. Nearly annihilated, their valor became legendary and enabled many Americans to escape back to the main defenses at Brooklyn Heights. By day's end, the Continental Army was trapped in its fortifications, with the East River at its back and superior British forces pressing forward. The situation was dire. The entire American army seemed on the verge of destruction. Yet General Howe hesitated. Rather than launching an immediate assault, he chose to besiege, believing Washington was already cornered and would soon surrender. That delay gave the Americans a golden chance. On the night of August 29, 1776, Washington organized a miraculous retreat. Under cover of darkness, favorable winds, and a dense morning fog, about 9,000 troops quietly crossed the East River to Manhattan. When the British advanced into the works the next morning, they found the enemy gone as if by miracle. This withdrawal is considered one of Washington's greatest strategic feats, saving the Continental Army from annihilation. The Battle of Long Island was nonetheless a crushing defeat for the Americans. They lost around 3,000 men killed, wounded, or captured, compared to only 500 British casualties. New York fell to the British and, from September 1776 onward, became their principal base of operations for the remainder of the war. Psychologically, it was a heavy blow. Only weeks after declaring independence, the young nation suffered a major setback, shaking public confidence. Yet the defeat taught vital lessons. It proved that the survival of the revolution depended not on holding territory at all costs, but on preserving the Continental Army itself. Washington realized he could not fight pitched battles indefinitely against a better armed, and more numerous enemy. Instead, the strategy would have to rely on maneuver, tactical retreats, and selective engagements when advantages could be seized. The escape from Long Island became a model of that approach. The setback also forced Congress and the states to strengthen the army, improve training and discipline, and underscored the need for international alliances. America could not hope to defeat Britain alone. In sum, the Battle of Long Island in August 1776 was both a tragedy and a turning point. A tragedy because it exposed the fragility of the fledgling American army and cost them New York, the economic heart of the colonies. But a turning point because from this failure Washington and his compatriots learned the hard truth that independence would require patience, resilience, and opportunism. The fog-shrouded retreat became a symbol. Though beset by peril, the American Revolution endured, sustained by determination and the will to fight on. The Battle of Princeton, 1777. After the defeat at the Battle of Long Island in late August 1776, Washington's Continental Army was forced to abandon Brooklyn and retreat into Manhattan. Yet the miraculous escape across the East River was only the beginning of a grueling series of trials. The British Empire, wielding overwhelming strength, pressed forward with the aim of crushing the revolutionaries and ending the rebellion swiftly. Confronted with this superior force, Washington had no choice but to lead a long, painful retreat through New York and into New Jersey during the autumn, fighting to preserve the army's survival. This period is often described as the darkest hour of the American Revolution. In early September 1776, after securing Long Island, General William Howe landed on Manhattan. Washington initially tried to defend the city, but soon realized it was untenable. The British Navy dominated the harbors and could land troops anywhere. On September 15th, British forces stormed ashore at Kips Bay, where panicked American militia fled in disarray. Washington, enraged and nearly captured on the field, was forced to order a retreat. A brief glimmer of hope came the next day at the Battle of Harlem Heights, September 16, 1776, where the Americans repelled a British advance, lifting morale slightly, but the overall balance of power remained firmly with Britain. In October, Washington entrenched at White Plains, north of the city, but on October 28 Howe attacked again, forcing yet another withdrawal. Ultimately, the Americans fell back into Fort Washington on the west bank of the Hudson. Holding the stronghold proved disastrous. On November 16, 1776, British and Hessian troops stormed the fort, capturing more than 2,800 Americans along with large stores of arms and ammunition. It was Washington's heaviest loss of the war thus far, and historians often judge his decision not to evacuate the fort earlier as a grave mistake. After this shock, Washington was left with fewer than 4,000 effective soldiers. He retreated across the Hudson into New Jersey, pursued closely by General Charles Cornwallis. Through November and December, the Americans trudged through Newark, New Brunswick, and Princeton, a desperate retreat marked by desertions, disease, and plummeting morale. By the time they reached the western bank of the Delaware River in early December, Washington had barely 2,400 men under arms. Revolutionary morale hit rock bottom. Many New Jersey civilians, seeing American forces in constant flight, began siding with, or at least tolerating, the British to avoid reprisals. The Continental Congress, meeting in Philadelphia, panicked and fled to Baltimore. Even within the army, despair was rife. Most enlistments were due to expire at the end of December, meaning Washington might soon be left with no army at all. At this moment, Washington faced a bitter reality. The revolution itself might collapse within months of declaring independence. Unless he could win a dramatic success to restore confidence, retain soldiers, and persuade the people that independence remained possible, the cause would be lost. It was in this darkest hour that Washington's leadership shone. Refusing to surrender to despair, he secretly prepared a bold counterstrike. Learning that Hessian troops in Trenton, New Jersey, had grown complacent after repeated victories, Washington devised a daring plan to cross the icy Delaware River on Christmas night and launch a surprise attack. This gamble, though perilous, offered the only hope of reversing the tide. During this bleak retreat, one enduring legacy emerged: the publication of Thomas Paine's The American Crisis in December 1776. Its famous opening line, "These are the times that try men's souls," was read aloud to the troops at Washington's order, rallying them to endure hardship and hold fast for the coming battle. In sum, the New Jersey retreat of late 1776 was a bitter sequence of defeats that decimated the Continental Army, shattered morale, and brought the fledgling United States to the brink of collapse. Yet in the depths of despair, Washington held firm, refusing to let the revolution die. Out of darkness, he prepared the bold stroke at Trenton, a victory that would rescue the cause of independence from near destruction. The Battle of Brandywine, 1777. By the end of 1776, the American Revolution stood on the brink of collapse. After a string of defeats at Long Island, Manhattan, White Plains, and the loss of Fort Washington, Washington's army was reduced to about 2,400 exhausted men, morale was shattered, and most enlistments were set to expire on December 31st. The Continental Congress had fled Philadelphia, civilians in New Jersey had lost faith, and many began cooperating with the British. In this dire situation, Washington realized that unless he won a decisive victory, the revolution would be over. The opportunity came at Trenton, New Jersey, where about 1,400 Hessian mercenaries, German troops hired by Britain, under Colonel Johann Rall were stationed. The Hessians were known for discipline and toughness, but after a run of victories, they had grown overconfident. On Christmas night, December 25, 1776, while many Hessians feasted and let down their guard, Washington resolved to take the gamble, to cross the icy Delaware River in a snowstorm and strike at dawn. Washington's plan was audacious. He divided his army into 3 crossing columns, but only his main force of about 2,400 troops with artillery managed to get across. The night was brutally cold, with ice clogging the river and sleet whipping through the air. Soldiers, lacking winter clothing, left bloody footprints in the snow. Yet Washington rode along the lines on horseback, urging them onward. His image standing aboard the boat during the crossing would later become an immortal symbol in American art and history. At around 8 a.m. on December 26th, the Americans advanced into Trenton from 2 directions. The Hessians were caught completely by surprise. Many were still drunk or asleep after Christmas celebrations. Fierce fighting broke out for several hours, but the American surprise attack and accurate artillery fire quickly decided the battle. Colonel Rall was mortally wounded, and his men fell into confusion. By the end, about 900 Hessians were captured, along with badly needed weapons, ammunition, and supplies. Amazingly, the Americans suffered almost no significant losses, only a handful killed in action or dead from exposure on the march. It was the first truly resounding victory after months of defeat. Its impact went far beyond the battlefield. Morale soared. The Continental Army's spirit was revived, the civilian population regained faith in the cause, and thousands of soldiers agreed to extend their enlistments. Washington wisely did not linger in Trenton, knowing a British counterattack was imminent. The following day, he withdrew his troops safely back across the Delaware, carrying prisoners and captured supplies. The operation had been executed with precision, stunning both the British and their Hessian allies. In the long run, the victory at Trenton carried immense strategic significance. It rescued the Revolution's morale at its most critical moment. It proved Washington's ability as a bold, calculating leader willing to take risks when necessary. It galvanized American soldiers and civilians, while shocking European observers, showing that Americans could defeat Britain's professional troops. Many historians have argued that without Trenton, the revolution might have ended in the winter of 1776. Thanks to this triumph, Washington preserved his army, restored public confidence and congressional support, and paved the way for further successes, most notably the Battle of Princeton just 1 week later, on January 3, 1777. In sum, Trenton was a turning point. From the depths of despair, Washington turned the tide with one audacious strike, breathing new life into the Revolution. The event is often remembered as the rebirth of American independence, a testament that resolve and courage can overcome seemingly insurmountable hardship. The Battles of Saratoga, 1777. After the resounding victory at Trenton on December 26, 1776, Washington withdrew his army back across the Delaware River to avoid a British counterattack. But he knew that a single success was not enough to change the course of the war. The British still held overwhelming strength in New Jersey, and unless Washington acted again, the Continental Army's newly restored morale would quickly fade. Thus, he devised another bold strike, Princeton. On December 30th, 1776, Washington re-entered New Jersey with about 5,000 troops, bolstered by reinforcements. The British, under General Charles Cornwallis with roughly 8,000 men, advanced toward Trenton to crush Washington. On January 2, 1777, the two sides clashed at the Battle of Assunpink Creek. The British launched repeated assaults to break through the bridge, but the Americans repelled them each time. That night, Cornwallis believed he had trapped Washington, confident that a final attack the next morning would end the struggle. The British even rested, preparing for the decisive blow. Washington, however, refused to wait. Instead, he carried out a daring plan, a secret nighttime withdrawal, looping around behind the British to strike Princeton, where a garrison of British troops was stationed. To deceive Cornwallis, he ordered campfires left burning brightly and a small detachment to maintain appearances, while the main army quietly slipped away on back roads. At dawn on January 3, 1777, the Americans unexpectedly appeared near Princeton. They first encountered about 800 British soldiers under Colonel Charles Mawhood. Fierce fighting broke out. At first, the Americans wavered. Some militia units broke ranks and fled in confusion. At the critical moment, however, Washington rode to the very front, only yards from the British line, rallying his men to stand firm. His officers feared he would be shot down, but miraculously, volleys of musket fire left him unharmed. His personal courage electrified the troops. They turned, fought back, and ultimately drove the British from the field. The results were decisive. About 200 British were killed or wounded, and over 200 captured. The remainder retreated toward New Brunswick. American losses were significantly lighter. Washington quickly occupied Princeton, but, wary of British reinforcements, he did not stay long. He led his army north into the safety of the Morristown Highlands to winter quarters. Though not a large battle in purely military terms, Princeton carried immense strategic weight. It showed Washington could outmaneuver Britain's veteran generals with cunning and audacity. It lifted American morale to new heights, reigniting the revolutionary spirit after months of despair. It forced the British to abandon most of New Jersey, retreating to defensive positions around New York. Together, Trenton and Princeton formed the core of Washington's winter campaign that saved the Revolution from collapse. Historians call these events the 10 Crucial Days, December 25, 1776, January 3, 1777, when the fate of the United States was nearly decided. Failure could have ended the rebellion, but success revived it, preserving the army, public confidence, and the cause of independence. In the long term, Princeton also solidified Washington's image as a courageous leader, willing to risk his life on the front lines with his men. The vision of him rallying the troops under enemy fire became legendary, celebrated in memoirs, paintings, and later biographies. Thus, Trenton and Princeton together transformed the crisis of late 1776 into renewed hope for 1777. From near destruction, the American Revolution regained the initiative, while the British realized the war would not end nearly as easily as they had once believed. The American occupation of Philadelphia, 1777. In 1777, Britain's grand strategy focused on splitting the 13 rebellious colonies. Their plan was to seize the Hudson River Valley, isolating New England, the heart of the rebellion, from the middle and southern colonies. 3 British armies were to converge. General John Burgoyne would lead about 8,000 men south from Canada along the Hudson. General Barry Street Ledger would advance from the west through the Mohawk Valley. General William Howe, commander in New York, was to march north from New York City to join them. If successful, the British would strangle New England and crush the Revolution. But events turned out very differently. Burgoyne set out from Canada in the summer of 1777 with a cumbersome supply train that even included servants and luxury items. He captured Fort Ticonderoga in July, alarming the Americans. But the march through wilderness was slow and grueling. His army soon suffered food shortages and constant harassment by American militia. Meanwhile, St. Leger was checked at Oriskany and forced to retreat. Most critical of all, Howe abandoned the plan entirely, choosing instead to attack Philadelphia. This left Burgoyne isolated, advancing alone toward Saratoga. At first, the Americans were weak in defense, but the rising spirit of resistance after Trenton and Princeton rallied them. Under Generals Horatio Gates and Benedict Arnold, they blocked Burgoyne near Saratoga. Two major battles followed. Battle of Freeman's Farm, September 19, 1777. Burgoyne attacked, but the Americans held firm, thanks largely to Arnold's courage. Although the Americans eventually withdrew, British losses were heavy and reinforcements never came. Battle of Bemis Heights, October 7, 1777. Burgoyne attacked again, but was fiercely repelled. Arnold, though restrained by Gates, rode into battle and led a ferocious counterattack, throwing the British into disarray. Burgoyne, surrounded and cut off, had no escape. On October 17, 1777, Burgoyne was forced to surrender at Saratoga, handing over about 6,000 troops and all weapons and supplies. It was the greatest American victory of the war so far. The significance of Saratoga went far beyond the battlefield. It shattered Britain's plan to divide the colonies. It raised American morale to unprecedented heights. Most importantly, it convinced France to officially join the war. For years, France had sought revenge for its defeat in the 7 Years' War, 1756-1763, but doubted whether America could win. Saratoga proved the revolution had a real chance of success. In early 1778, France signed the Treaty of Alliance with the United States, bringing powerful armies and navies into the struggle. This turned the revolution from a colonial rebellion into a global war against Britain, soon involving Spain and the Netherlands as well. Yet Saratoga also created a paradox within America. General Gates was hailed as the hero of Saratoga, while Benedict Arnold, the true architect of the victory through his bold leadership, was overlooked. This injustice fed Arnold's growing resentment, which later drove him to betray the revolution. Even so, in the larger scope of history, Saratoga was the decisive turning point. Without this victory, the United States might never have secured France's vital support, and the revolution could have ended in failure. Thanks to Saratoga, the balance of power shifted in America's favor, paving the way for the decisive final phase of the war. The Winter at Valley Forge, 1777-1778. After the resounding victory at Saratoga in October 1777, the course of the American Revolution changed dramatically. This was not only the first major military triumph, but also compelling proof to the European powers, especially France, that the Americans could truly endure a long war against the British Empire. For years, France had harbored a deep grudge against Britain after its humiliating defeat in the 7 Years' War, in which it lost nearly all of its colonies in North America and India. The French government was eager for revenge. Yet when the American Revolution first broke out, France, under Foreign Minister Charles Gravier, Count of Vergennes, remained cautious. It limited itself to covert support, funneling arms and ammunition through secret ports, wary of openly confronting Britain in case the Americans were defeated, which could drag France into an unfavorable war. The victory at Saratoga dispelled those doubts. France now believed the American cause had a real chance of success, and that intervention could effectively weaken Britain. At the same time, the American revolutionaries, led by Benjamin Franklin, the gifted American diplomat in Paris, seized the moment to push relations forward. With his simple yet shrewd demeanor, Franklin charmed French aristocrats and intellectuals, becoming a living symbol of the new Republican spirit. Public opinion in France increasingly pressured the government to act. On February 6, 1778, at Versailles, two crucial treaties were signed: the Treaty of Amity and Commerce and the Treaty of Alliance. The Treaty of Amity and Commerce established free trade between the United States and France, while the Treaty of Alliance marked the true turning point. France formally recognized the independence of the United States and pledged full military support. Both sides further promised not to sign a separate peace with Britain. This meant that the war was no longer just a colonial rebellion. It had become an international conflict, with one of Europe's great powers siding with America against Britain. French involvement completely altered the balance of the war. The Continental Army now had access to weapons, ammunition, financing, and, most importantly, the French Navy, which would prove decisive in later battles such as Yorktown. Moreover, French entry into the war triggered the indirect involvement of other powers, Spain in 1779 and the Dutch Republic in 1780. Britain suddenly had to fight a global war, stretching its forces from North America to the Caribbean, India, and the waters of Europe. The Franco-American alliance of 1778 is therefore regarded as one of the most critical turning points of the Revolution. Without France's intervention, it is difficult to imagine how the Americans, with their limited resources, could have stood alone and ultimately defeated the most powerful empire of the 18th century. The Battle of Monmouth, 1778. After the American defeat in the Philadelphia Campaign, with the capital falling into British hands in September 1777, even as the Northern Army had just won a resounding victory at Saratoga, the situation of the Continental Army in the Mid-Atlantic remained extremely difficult. General George Washington decided to withdraw his troops to winter quarters at Valley Forge, about 20 miles northwest of Philadelphia, in order to maintain a defensive posture while preserving his army. That winter became one of the harshest and most symbolic trials of the entire American Revolution. From December 1777 to June 1778, more than 12,000 American soldiers encamped at Valley Forge endured brutal cold, shortages of food, clothing, shoes, and medicine. Many lacked footwear, leaving bloody footprints in the snow, while thousands more suffered from diseases such as typhoid, dysentery, pneumonia, and smallpox. Nearly 2,500 soldiers died, and countless others deserted out of exhaustion or despair. The deprivation was partly due to the Continental Congress's financial weakness, partly due to a broken supply system and dishonest contractors, forcing Washington to repeatedly write letters pleading for support from Congress and the states. Yet Valley Forge was not only a place of hardship, it was where the Continental Army was reborn. Early in 1778, an important figure arrived, Baron Friedrich Wilhelm von Steuben, a former Prussian officer introduced to America by Benjamin Franklin. With his professional military knowledge, von Steuben began systematically training the soldiers, marching drills, handling muskets, organizing formations, and conducting battlefield maneuvers. Under his strict but effective guidance, scattered farmers were transformed into a disciplined, professional force capable of standing toe-to-toe with the British Army. Valley Forge thus became a symbol not only of suffering but also of resilience, where Washington demonstrated his leadership by sharing in the hardships of his men, strengthening their loyalty and trust. When spring 1778 came, news of the Franco-American alliance reached Valley Forge, renewing hope that their sacrifices were not in vain. By June 1778, the Continental Army marched out of Valley Forge looking entirely different, disciplined, confident, and well-organized, ready for new battles. The winter at Valley Forge is therefore remembered in history as a decisive turning point, a time when extreme hardship laid the foundation for the Continental Army's transformation from a ragtag militia into a force truly capable of challenging the world's most powerful empire. The winter encampment at Valley Forge, 1777-1778. After the harsh winter at Valley Forge, the American Army had been reorganized and thoroughly trained thanks to the efforts of von Steuben. By the summer of 1778, they had the chance to prove themselves in a major battle when the British decided to evacuate Philadelphia and return to New York due to the growing threat of the French Navy after the Franco-American alliance. On June 18, 1778, General Sir Henry Clinton, who had just replaced General William Howe as commander of British forces in North America, led about 12,000 troops out of Philadelphia, marching across New Jersey in sweltering heat toward New York. General George Washington recognized this as a golden opportunity to strike the British while they were slowed down by a cumbersome baggage train. He ordered the Continental Army, now numbering around 13,000 men, to pursue them. The decisive battle took place on June 28, 1778, near the village of Monmouth Courthouse. At first, Washington entrusted the advance attack to General Charles Lee, but Lee acted indecisively and ordered a disorderly retreat upon encountering the main British force, putting the situation in grave danger. Furious at the chaotic withdrawal, Washington rode to the front lines himself, personally rallying the troops and restoring order. The sight of Washington upright on horseback, commanding through clouds of musket smoke, inspired his soldiers and deepened their loyalty to him. Once discipline was re-established, Washington positioned his main force in strong defensive lines, repelling repeated British assaults under the blazing heat. The day was so hot that folklore tells of Molly Pitcher, a woman who carried water to the soldiers and then manned her husband's cannon after he fell. The brutal fighting lasted all day, with heavy casualties on both sides, including many soldiers who collapsed and died of heat stroke. By nightfall, the British withdrew in good order and continued their march to New York, while the Americans held the field. Strategically, the Battle of Monmouth ended in a draw, since the British successfully completed their retreat. Symbolically, however, it was a major American triumph. For the first time, the Continental Army had stood firm and fought the British regulars on open ground without breaking or fleeing, unlike in the early years of the war. Most importantly, Monmouth was clear proof of the effectiveness of von Steuben's training at Valley Forge, transforming a ragtag militia into a disciplined fighting force. It also confirmed Washington's leadership, silencing doubts from Congress and within the Army after earlier defeats. After Monmouth, the war in the North gradually slowed, as the British shifted their focus to the South, where they hoped to exploit Loyalist support and capture strategic ports. Still, Monmouth remains a crucial milestone marking the coming of age of the American Army, showing that it was now ready for the long struggle against the world's most powerful empire. The Southern Campaign, 1778-1781. After failing to crush the rebellion in the North, especially following the battles of Saratoga and Monmouth, the British were forced to change their strategy. They believed that in the South, with its wealthy plantations and a larger Loyalist population, they could more easily regain control. The South was also a vital source of cotton, tobacco, and rice, strategic commodities that could sustain the war effort. With this mindset, at the end of 1778, the British launched a new campaign, targeting major ports and key supply lines in the South. In December 1778, they captured Savannah, Georgia, quickly turning it into a stronghold. In 1779, Franco-American forces mounted a counteroffensive to retake Savannah, but the attack ended in a disastrous failure, further strengthening the British position. The peak of the campaign came in May 1780, when British forces under General Henry Clinton laid siege to Charleston, South Carolina, forcing the city to surrender and capturing over 5,000 American troops, one of the Continental Army's greatest defeats of the entire war. Following this victory, the British believed their southern strategy had succeeded, and that by establishing Loyalist governments they could restore control over the region. However, reality proved otherwise. Instead of submitting, Southerners launched a fierce guerrilla resistance. Leaders such as Francis Marion, the Swamp Fox, Thomas Sumter, the Carolina Gamecock, and Andrew Pickens organized ambushes, cut British supply lines, and constantly harassed the occupiers, dragging them into a war of attrition. Meanwhile, the Continental Army under General Horatio Gates suffered a disastrous defeat at Camden in August 1780. Yet this setback opened the way for the rise of General Nathanael Greene, whom Washington entrusted with command of the Southern Theater. Greene adopted a strategy of fight, then retreat, dividing his forces into smaller units to avoid direct large-scale confrontations while relentlessly wearing down the British through constant skirmishes. Key Patriot victories at Kings Mountain, 1780, and Cowpens, 1781, shifted the momentum, proving that Southern colonists would not easily submit as the British had expected. In particular, Kings Mountain was a turning point, as Loyalist forces were almost completely annihilated, shattering the British plan of relying on local support. From then on, the Southern Campaign turned into a costly quagmire. The British were forced to pull back and concentrate their forces in Virginia, where they ultimately became trapped at Yorktown. Thus, although the Southern strategy initially brought the British a string of successes, it became a strategic blunder, draining resources while giving the Americans and their French allies the chance to coordinate. leading to the final defeat of the British Empire. The Battle of Camden, 1780. After the British captured Charleston in May 1780 and secured most of South Carolina, American resistance in the South suffered a severe blow. In an effort to restore the situation, the Continental Congress appointed General Horatio Gates, celebrated as the hero of Saratoga after his glorious victory in 1777, to command the Southern forces. Gates launched a bold campaign to retake South Carolina, but rash and poorly calculated decisions led to disaster. In August 1780, Gates marched south with about 3,200 men, most of them inexperienced and undisciplined militia, to attack Camden, a strategic outpost commanded by General Charles Cornwallis, with roughly 2,500 professional British troops and mercenaries. On the night of August 15, 16, the two armies unexpectedly collided on a narrow road near Camden, and the battle erupted in the sweltering Carolina summer heat. From the outset, the odds were stacked against the Americans. The Virginia militia that Gates had placed opposite the British center quickly collapsed under fierce cavalry and infantry attacks. Many fled the battlefield after only a few volleys, spreading chaos throughout the ranks. The remaining American forces, mainly the regulars from Maryland and Delaware, fought bravely under General Johann de Kalb, a French-born officer, but they were overwhelmed by the superior numbers and discipline of the British. De Kalb was mortally wounded and later died, becoming a tragic symbol of loyalty and valor. Meanwhile, instead of standing firm to lead his men, Horatio Gates fled the field, retreating over 100 kilometers in just a few days, abandoning his troops to their fate. The result was catastrophic. The Americans suffered over 2,000 casualties, while the British lost only about 300–400, a staggering disparity that underscored the gulf in organization and morale. The defeat at Camden shocked American public opinion and shattered Gates's reputation, leading to his removal from command and his fall into political obscurity. Yet this disaster also became a turning point. George Washington appointed General Nathanael Greene to replace Gates as commander of the Southern Theater. Greene, with his flexible strategy and skillful use of guerrilla warfare, would gradually shift the balance in the South. Thus, the Battle of Camden was not only a major military defeat, but also exposed the weaknesses in American leadership and organization, while highlighting the critical importance of capable command, something Washington finally secured in Greene after this debacle. The Battle of Kings Mountain, 1780. After the disaster at Camden, the situation in the South seemed to tilt decisively in favor of the British, but soon afterward, an event dramatically shifted the balance. In September 1780, General Charles Cornwallis, after securing victories in South Carolina, launched a campaign northward into North Carolina. To strengthen Loyalist support and secure the region, he entrusted Lieutenant Colonel Patrick Ferguson, a seasoned British officer, with the task of raising local Loyalist militia. Ferguson threatened that if the people living in the Appalachian frontier did not submit, he would devastate their homes and lands. Rather than intimidate, this threat inflamed the anger of the so-called over-mountain men, frontier farmers and hunters from Tennessee, Virginia, and North Carolina. Around 901,000 of them gathered under leaders such as Isaac Shelby, John Sevier, and William Campbell, determined to destroy Ferguson's force before he could link up with Cornwallis. On October 7, 1780, the two forces clashed at Kings Mountain, a small ridge near the North-South Carolina border. Ferguson, with about 1,100 Loyalists, fortified the slopes, confident that the high ground would give him the advantage. But the Americans, well-versed in mountain terrain, split into several groups and encircled the hill, advancing from all sides. Though repeatedly repelled by Ferguson's bayonet charges, the mountain riflemen persisted, firing from behind trees and rocks, gradually tightening the noose. The battle lasted over an hour. At last, Ferguson, still wearing his distinctive white jacket, attempted to lead a breakout, but was struck by multiple bullets and killed. With their commander dead, the Loyalist line quickly collapsed, over 1,000 captured, and nearly 300 killed or wounded. The victory at Kings Mountain carried enormous strategic and psychological weight. For the first time, a large Loyalist force was completely destroyed, shattering British hopes of relying on local support in the South. It also halted Cornwallis's advance into North Carolina, forcing him to retreat temporarily into South Carolina to regroup. For the Americans, the triumph reignited morale after a string of defeats, demonstrating the power of People's War and the effectiveness of cooperation between local militia and the Continental Army. Thus, the Battle of Kings Mountain is regarded as the turning point of the South in the American Revolution, paving the way for subsequent American victories in the final phase of the war. The Battle of Cowpens, 1781. After the morale-boosting victory at Kings Mountain, the resistance movement in the South gradually revived, though the situation remained difficult. The British, under General Charles Cornwallis, still controlled key strongholds and kept constant pressure on American forces. In this context, General Nathanael Greene, newly appointed by George Washington to replace Horatio Gates after the disaster at Camden, implemented a shrewd strategy, dividing his army into smaller detachments that were more mobile and easier to supply, while forcing the British to scatter and wear themselves down. One of these detachments, about 1,200 men consisting of regulars and militia, was placed under the command of General Daniel Morgan. Cornwallis, recognizing the threat Morgan posed to the British rear, dispatched Lieutenant Colonel Banastre Tarleton, the notorious and ruthless cavalry commander, with roughly 1,100 troops to hunt him down. On January 17, 1781, the two forces met at Cowpens, an open field near the Broad River in South Carolina. Morgan, well aware of Tarleton's aggression and impatience, devised a brilliantly cunning tactical plan. He arranged his troops in 3 lines. The first consisted of sharpshooters and militia, ordered to fire 2 volleys and retreat. The second, more experienced militia, instructed to hold briefly and then feign a withdrawal. And the third, his corps regulars from Maryland and Delaware, supported by cavalry under William Washington, a cousin of George Washington. As predicted, Tarleton launched a furious assault, convinced the Americans were breaking. When the British pressed forward in pursuit, they suddenly ran into the disciplined firepower of Morgan's Continental regulars. At that moment, the retreating militia wheeled around to rejoin the fight, while American cavalry charged in from the flank, completing a double envelopment. The British line collapsed into chaos. Nearly all of Tarleton's command was destroyed or captured, about 110 killed, over 200 wounded, and nearly 600 taken prisoner, while the Americans lost only around 70 men. It was one of the most devastating defeats suffered by the British during the war. The Battle of Cowpens was not only a resounding military victory, but also a masterpiece of battlefield tactics, often cited as a textbook example of the effective use of defense in depth and feigned retreat. It greatly enhanced Daniel Morgan's reputation and dealt a crippling blow to Cornwallis's army, severely weakening the British position in the South. After Cowpens, Cornwallis was forced to march north into North Carolina, beginning a bloody campaign that would lead to the Battle of Guilford Courthouse and ultimately to the fateful defeat at Yorktown. For the Americans, Cowpens proved that the combination of militia and regulars, of clever strategy and raw courage, could overcome one of the most professional armies in the world. The Battle of Guilford Courthouse, 1781. After the crushing defeat at Cowpens, General Charles Cornwallis was determined to regain the initiative by pursuing American forces in the South. Meanwhile, General Nathanael Greene, employing his shrewd strategy, avoided direct confrontation and instead carried out tactical retreats, drawing the British deep into North Carolina, where they struggled with supply shortages and steadily wore themselves down. After weeks of grueling pursuit, Cornwallis finally confronted Greene at Guilford Courthouse, modern-day Greensboro, North Carolina, on March 15, 1781. This was one of the most significant battles in the Southern Theater, involving around 4,500 Americans, regulars and militia from Virginia and North Carolina, against about 1,900–2,000 seasoned British troops. Greene, learning from Daniel Morgan's tactics at Cowpens, deployed his army in 3 defensive lines. The first line made up of inexperienced North Carolina militia, the second line, more reliable Virginia militia, and the final line, the Continental regulars supported by cavalry under William Washington. Greene's plan was to force the British to smash through successive layers of resistance, exhausting themselves before clashing with his strongest troops. Cornwallis, though heavily outnumbered, boldly committed his entire army to the assault. As expected, the North Carolina militia quickly broke under the initial onslaught, but the second line, and especially the final line, fought fiercely, turning the battle into a prolonged struggle in dense woods and difficult terrain. In the climactic stage, with his troops in danger of being surrounded, Cornwallis made the desperate decision to fire his artillery into both the enemy and his own soldiers to break the encirclement. Greene, realizing his army had suffered heavy losses and could not hold the ground much longer, executed an orderly withdrawal, preserving most of his core force. Tactically, the British could claim victory by holding the battlefield, but it was a Pyrrhic victory, won at too great a cost. The British lost around 500–600 men, nearly one-third of their army, including many of their best officers and soldiers, while the Americans lost about 250–300. Though Cornwallis held the field, his army was left exhausted, undersupplied, and compelled to retreat toward the Virginia coast to await reinforcements from the Royal Navy. Thus, the Battle of Guilford Courthouse marked a turning point. It proved that Greene's strategy of attrition was working, steadily eroding British control of the South. For the Americans, what seemed like a defeat was in fact a strategic success, as it set Cornwallis on the path to entrapment, ultimately driving him into Virginia, where the fatal trap at Yorktown awaited. The Siege of Yorktown, 1781. After the Battle of Guilford Courthouse, General Charles Cornwallis found himself in a dire situation. His army was severely weakened, supplies were scarce, and the American resistance movement was gaining strength. He decided to march into Virginia, a region rich in resources and politically vital, hoping to sever the American supply lines. By mid-1781, Cornwallis had concentrated his forces at the port town of Yorktown, a strategic position at the mouth of the York River, where he awaited reinforcements from the Royal Navy. However, this decision turned Yorktown into a trap. General George Washington, together with his French ally General Rochambeau, seized the opportunity. Instead of attacking New York as the British had anticipated, Washington secretly moved his army south to join forces with Marquis de Lafayette and Comte de Grasse, the French naval commander. The French fleet played a decisive role. In September 1781, they defeated the Royal Navy at the Battle of the Chesapeake, securing complete control of the seas and cutting off all reinforcements and escape routes for Cornwallis. On land, about 8,000 American troops and 7,000 French soldiers besieged more than 6,000 British troops entrenched at Yorktown. The siege formally began on September 28, 1781. The Allied forces gradually tightened the encirclement, digging trenches, bringing their artillery closer, and bombarding the defenses relentlessly. Fierce assaults followed, most notably the storming of redoubts 9 and 10 by French and American troops on the night of October 14th, which broke open the British defensive line. Surrounded on all sides, short of food, and with morale collapsing, Cornwallis attempted a desperate river crossing to escape, but failed due to a violent storm. On October 19, 1781, Cornwallis was forced to surrender his entire army to Washington and Rochambeau. More than 7,000 British and Loyalist troops were captured along with tons of weapons and supplies. The defeat sent shockwaves through Britain, as Yorktown was not merely a military loss but the collapse of the entire imperial strategy to hold the colonies. In America, the news of victory spread rapidly, sparking celebrations and strengthening the belief that independence was finally within reach. The Battle of Yorktown is regarded as the decisive showdown of the American Revolutionary War. It underscored the importance of the Franco-American alliance, demonstrating the perfect coordination of land and naval forces, as well as the synergy of diplomacy and military power. After this disaster, the British Parliament quickly lost the will to continue the war. Already under enormous public pressure and financial strain, the British government was compelled to pursue peace negotiations. From Yorktown began the path leading to the Treaty of Paris, 1783, which formally recognized the independence of the United States of America. The Treaty of Paris, 1783. After the devastating defeat at Yorktown in October 1781, the British government fell into crisis. News of Cornwallis's surrender outraged the British public, gave the parliamentary opposition powerful ammunition, and steadily eroded the will to continue the war. Although a few skirmishes continued in America and the Caribbean, the conflict had, in essence, reached its end. Britain, financially exhausted and simultaneously engaged in a global struggle against France, Spain, and the Netherlands, was forced to seek a peaceful settlement. In 1782, Prime Minister Lord North resigned, and the new government of Charles Rockingham leaned decisively toward negotiation. In Paris, diplomatic delegations began formal talks. The American side was represented by Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, John Jay, and Henry Lawrence. Britain was represented by Richard Oswald, while France and Spain also took part as allies and negotiating partners. The Americans, though allied with France, shrewdly negotiated directly with Britain to secure the greatest possible concessions and to prevent France and Spain from limiting their territorial claims. After many rounds of tense negotiations, on September 3, 1783, the Treaty of Paris was officially signed, bringing the Revolutionary War to an end. Under the treaty, Britain recognized the independence of the United States, with vast borders, to the north with Canada, to the south reaching Florida, returned to Spain, and to the west extending to the Mississippi River. Americans were granted the right to fish off Newfoundland and in the waters off Canada, an important economic concession. In return, the United States pledged to restore property to Loyalists and to repay debts owed to British creditors, although in practice many of these commitments were only partially fulfilled. The treaty also concluded the parallel conflicts between Britain, France, and Spain, reshaping the balance of power in both Europe and the New World. With the Treaty of Paris, the American Revolutionary War formally ended after 8 arduous years. A new nation, the United States of America, was born, laying the foundations for a modern democratic republic and inspiring future movements for national liberation around the globe. For Americans, the treaty was not merely an international legal recognition of independence, but also a symbol of unity, the will for freedom, and the sharpness of their diplomacy. For Britain, it was a bitter defeat, yet it opened the door for rebuilding trade relations with America in the decades that followed. The Treaty of Paris, 1783, thus stands as a historic milestone, ending one war while ushering in a new era in human history.